German troops were in occupation of 14 sovereign states: France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Greece, Yugoslavia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The Soviet republics of Belarus and Ukraine were occupied. Italy was an ally, and so too were Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The Eastern Front remained a contest between two great continental empires. So was Stalingrad decisive? Like Midway, Stalingrad was a battle in which both sides lost heavily. But it proved that the German Empire was not invincible, that Soviet generals were at least a match for their German counterparts, above all, that the Soviet Union alone was able to pay the cost of exorbitantly expensive victories. It would do so again at Kursk when the Wehrmacht, still deep in Soviet territory, would once again go on the offensive. What Stalingrad, along with Midway and the reversal of fortunes in North Africa, did do was persuade people on the Allied side, from the lowest to the highest, that they had turned the corner.
The beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
Churchill was referring to the Second Battle of El Alamein. Through July and August, as we have learned, Rommel was checked in North Africa. His newly arrived adversary, Montgomery, was first tested when Rommel launched an offensive with, as his objective, the British fuel depot. Fuel supply to the Afrika Korps was a constant problem. The key to Rommel's plan was a swing against the Alam Halfa Ridge. He was beaten back and in early September withdrew to his start line. Montgomery was determined to build up a superiority in every type of arms before rejoining the fight. Some of the tactics were less than orthodox. Dummy tanks were positioned to persuade observers that the attack was forming in a certain place, and real tanks were also disguised.
There was a framework on the outside of the tanks with canvas on, all painted to look like a lorry, and it did look like a lorry. And there was any number of tanks behind the front line like this. Lorries had been parked in an area, and they'd pull out overnight, and you'd pull in overnight. And this really fooled the Germans quite a bit.
The Second Battle of El Alamein opened on the night of 22nd, 23rd October 1942 with the first significant British bombardment since the end of the First World War.
The poor Germans, they got it. So Montgomery. He opened up with over 1,000 pieces of artillery on that Alamein line. It came over like hailstones.
The line from which the offensive would move stretched from the coast road south to the impassable Katara Depression. 13th Corps General Horrocks at the southern end of the line would push against General Benvenuto Gioda's 10th Corps. The aim was to draw Rommel's armour south. The main attack would be in the north, 30th Corps, General Leese advancing through minefields. New Zealanders and South Africans fought side by side on the southern end of 30th Corps' advance, the New Zealanders scoring an early success with the capture of Miteria Ridge. Up towards the coast, the advance of 9th Australian Division was slowed by the minefield, as was the push from both 1st and 10th Armoured Divisions. On the 25th, Rommel, who had been in Germany for medical treatment when the attack was launched, arrived in Africa and resumed command of the Afrika Korps. Both the north and south thrusts of Montgomery's attack stalled on the 25th. The feared 88mm anti-tank weapon was particularly effective. The battle hung in the balance.
The star shells flying everywhere, and there was a lot of whistling going on. So the air was full of it. If you dropped the ground every time you had a whistling sound, you'd never get up.
For 2 days, blow and counter-blow were traded without decisive outcome. On the 28th, Churchill expressed his anxiety. Plans for an Allied landing at the western end of the littoral in French North Africa were about to be implemented, and advancing from the east to effect the link-up was vital. On the 29th, Montgomery changed the plan. Supercharge now had the Australian division on the coast road as the feint. The attack began on November 2nd, 6 days before the landings were scheduled for French North Africa.
Back, I remember there was one tank sitting out in front burning one of ours, and there was a voice in my ear saying, "Help, help me." The operator in that tank had been on the wireless when his tank was hit, and somebody was trapped in that tank. The wireless was still on. God's sake, help me. One of our tanks put a shot through the side of it and the voice stopped.
As Supercharge began to bite into the Axis lines, Rommel, whose forces were desperately short of fuel and ammunition, was obliged to withdraw. The pursuit of Rommel across Libya began on November the 4th, and on the 10th, Churchill declared the end of the beginning.
One morning we saw a lot of burning going on. Another recce troop was sent forward and came back the signal, "Oh, it's a general exodus." In other words, the Germans are pulling back. So we chased them all the way up the coast.
2nd El Alamein was clearly an Allied victory. The enemy was in full-scale retreat. But a sense of proportion is necessary. At the midpoint of 1942, there were 8 Italian and 4 German divisions in North Africa. There were 12 and 5, respectively, in the Balkans, 26 German divisions in Western Europe and 12 in Norway, and 197 Axis divisions on the Eastern Front.
Though Rommel was on the run, he was fighting with all the stubborn skill and resource you'd naturally expect from this general.
As the 8th Army drove west in pursuit of Rommel, it may be said to have represented the last hurrah of a once great empire. On the other side of North Africa, her allies' ground troops were entering the war against Hitler under the supreme command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The Yanks were coming. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, began on November the 8th when landings in 3 places met with strong French resistance. These were forces loyal to the Vichy French government.
There was a French Navy ship that started firing at us. I believe it was the Vichy French who opposed us, and our battleship sunk them at the pier. And all the troop ships had their formation of landing craft gathered together, and they emerged onto the beach. A lot of the LCVPs that carried the troops into the beach were unable to dock efficiently on them, drowned in the water because of the heavy weight on his shoulder.
General Patton's Western Task Force landed at 3 points on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. The Centre Task Force landed at Oran, and the Eastern, west of Algiers, both in Algeria. On November the 10th, Admiral François Darlan, Vichy High Commissioner in Algiers, ordered an end to resistance to the invasion. Vichy Prime Minister Pierre Laval hurried to Berlin to assure Hitler that Darlan had acted illegally. But the Führer was not impressed, and the next day he ordered German troops to occupy the whole of France, bringing the pretense of the Zone Libre to an end. He sent an explanation of his action to the Vichy leader, Philippe Pétain. It is to be regretted, he wrote, that unscrupulous Anglo-Saxons and primarily Jewish wire-pullers succeeded in interpreting every conciliatory gesture of the new Reich as a sign of weakness. Hitler told Pétain that inciters in Paris demanded dismemberment of the German Reich. He complained that they sought the enslavement of the German people, above all, complete restoration of the unrestricted right of plunder by the Jewish race. On the 11th of November 1942, the anniversary of the armistice that had ended the First World War, the French in North Africa signed an armistice with the Allies who began their advance on Tunis, which would hold out until April, when it became the jumping-off point for the invasion of Sicily. In the Pacific, major campaigns were changing the power balance of the war. An archipelago of almost 1,000 islands, Solomon Islands is critically positioned off the northeastern cape of Australia. The Japanese called the main island Guadalcanal. The Americans called it Cactus. Its name is Guadalcanal. Japanese troops landed there in April 1942 and were soon observed to be building an airbase. Such a facility could threaten mainland Australia and naval and combined operations throughout the theatre of war. On July the 2nd, the American Chiefs of Staff ordered the capture of Solomon Islands. Little over a month later, on August 7th, American forces landed on Guadalcanal. It was the first landing by American forces in the Pacific and the first of a series of island names to be indelibly inscribed in American history. The primary target of the Marines who landed on Red Beach was the airstrip that the Japanese had been constructing. When the Marines overran the airfield on August 12th, they named it for one of their number killed in action at Midway, Major Lofton Henderson. Henderson Field became the site of one of the bloodiest of the Pacific battles. The night after the initial landing, a Japanese naval task force of 7 cruisers and a destroyer caught an Allied force steaming through the 15-kilometre-wide channel between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, sinking the American and Australian cruisers with the loss of 1,270 Allied seamen and 34 Japanese dead. Following the Battle of Savo Island, the US Navy withdrew, leaving the Marines on Guadalcanal without support. But the Japanese allowed their opportunity to pass, not bringing up reinforcements until August the 18th. The first Japanese counterattack went in on August the 21st. They attacked at night, because they believed that Americans, being effeminate, did not like fighting at night. 900 men, commanded by Colonel Ishiki, attacked at the Battle of Tenaru River. The Japanese were wiped out. The Americans lost 35 men. Colonel Ishiki committed harakiri, ritual suicide, and it is said that crocodiles feasted on the Japanese corpses. Later in August, continuing naval action in the waters around the Solomons swung the advantage there back to the Americans, whose fighters were by now operating from Henderson Field. Supply to Imperial Japanese Army troops on Guadalcanal was thereafter limited to vessels traveling from Bougainville at night. The Americans dubbed it the Tokyo Night Express. The next significant attempt to displace the Marines was led by General Kawaguchi. The Battle of Bloody Ridge in mid-September was fiercely contested. The Japanese were driven back with 600 dead. The Marines lost 150 men. By late September, Marine strength under General Vandergrift had risen to 23,000. The Japanese, recognizing the struggle that they faced, sent Lieutenant General Hyukutake from Rabaul with the 17th Army. By mid-October, the Japanese had built their force to about 20,000. The battle for Guadalcanal raged from mid-October until the final Japanese evacuation at the beginning of February 1943. In the first 2 weeks of December, the 1st U.S. Marine Division, severely debilitated by 6 weeks of fighting and the depredations of tropical disease, was relieved by 3 Marine divisions of 14th Corps, General Alexander Patch. Patch began offensive operations almost at once, and by early January, Japan realized that its position on Guadalcanal was not supportable. Losses to hunger and disease were far outstripping losses to enemy action. Evacuation was ordered. By early February, 1,600 Americans had been killed, as many as 32,000 Japanese had been lost to military action or disease. The Imperial Japanese Army had fared no better during the parallel campaign on New Guinea.
Now for a dispatch from the jungles of New Guinea by an Australian newsreel cameraman just back from the front, Damien Parra.
It's an uncanny sort of warfare. You never see a Jap even though he's only 20 yards away. They're complete masters of camouflage and deception. I should say about 40% of our boys wounded in those engagements. I haven't seen a Japanese soldier, a live one anyway.
In July 1942, a small formation comprising 1 Australian and 1 Papuan infantry battalion was sent from Port Moresby on the overland journey to Buna on New Guinea's north coast. Buna had a small airfield which General Douglas MacArthur determined he needed as a base for further operations. The small force that set off was named for one of Sydney's better beaches, Maroubra Force. Its journey lay along the Kokoda track, across the vertiginous and densely jungled Owen Stanley Ranges. Maroubra Force reached the village of Kokoda, about the halfway point of the track, in mid-July. Its orders from MacArthur were to move on Buna at the end of the month. Frustrated by the Battle of the Coral Sea in their plans to take Port Moresby from the Gulf of Papua, the Japanese decided to approach overland. A 2,000-man advance detachment under Colonel Yosuke Yokoyama landed at Gona on July 21st. Its orders were to make for Kokoda. The first contact between the Japanese and Maroubra Force occurred 2 days later. The 7th Australian Division was dispatched to Papua in early August, and in the middle of the month, 1 brigade began to move up the track. The journey along Kokoda was a journey into the malaria zone, and for every man that was wounded, 7 were incapacitated by sickness. Supplying troops on the track was also problematic. In the 8 days it took native bearers to reach frontline troops, they necessarily consumed half of the food that they carried. 2 days after the Australian 7th was dispatched, the main Japanese force of 11,500 men landed at Buna. By war's end, 157,646 Japanese soldiers would have been sent to New Guinea. Barely 6% of them were to survive.
One important scene of action has been Milne Bay. Our pictures show reinforcements arriving after the Japanese attempt to gain a foothold had been broken by Australians.
There was contact made with the Japanese for 4 nights when they would come and set up a machine gun alongside of a tree just across the runway. As fast as one would get killed there, another would take his place. They would do that for a number of hours. In the meantime, we had troops, infantry over their side, and gradually they got the upper hand. And they left 88 dead. There was a Japanese that had been machine gunned across his stomach, and he had both hands in there, and the pain of the... You have to think of somebody's son, somebody's father, or somebody's husband.
By September the 6th, the attempted invasion of Milne Bay had to be abandoned. Japanese troops were evacuated back to Rabaul. Milne Bay was the first outright defeat of Japanese troops. Importantly, it denied them the opportunity to establish an air base. After 2 more weeks of fierce fighting, the Australians began to advance along the Kokoda Track. Their objective, Buna, fell to them after weeks of vicious jungle fighting in atrocious conditions of heat, humidity and disease. In the Papua New Guinea campaign, the Allies lost 8,500 as battle casualties, the Japanese 12,000. Both sides lost many more to disease. Progress had been slow and the cost high, but the threat to Australia had been removed. In the next episode of The Price of Empire, the change of fortunes that has led to Allied victories gains in impetus. Through 1943, in the seas, the skies, in Eastern Europe, in Italy and North Africa, on the Eastern Front, and through the Pacific, there is a steady grinding away at the Axis powers. If 1942 had seen the end of the beginning, this was perhaps the beginning of the end.